Chapter 2. Circular Reasoning. To keep too close an eye on philosophy is sometimes to neglect to note how closely it is related to life. Before examining the philosophy of factuality, let us see how a prominent writer of the 20th century viewed the predicament of man and of man's efforts to know. Albert Camus, 1913 to 1960, saw man in revolt, gaining nothing out of his revolt except unlimited slavery. It can be held that there are, quote, only two possible worlds, end quote, conceivable to the thinking man, the world of grace and the world of rebellion, quote, the disappearance of the one is equivalent to the appearance of the other, end quote. Rebellion is now basic to modern man, quote, unless we choose to ignore reality, we must find our values in it. It is possible to find a rule of conduct outside the realm of religion and its absolute values. That is the question raised by rebellion, end quote. Modern man, isolated by his epistemology, finds his solidarity only in rebellion. Whereas for Descartes, the starting point was, quote, I think, therefore I am, end quote, for man today, quote, the first piece of evidence, end quote, is, quote, I rebel, therefore we exist, end quote. The Marquis de Sade is a classic example of the modern rebel. For him, all crimes are a virtue. All things are permitted, and all sexual perversions must be practiced with zeal as part of man's rebellion against God. Quote, since God claims all that is good in man, it is necessary to deride what is good and choose what is evil, end quote. The rebel thus has a will to evil. He systematically rejects salvation. The rejection of God leads to the rejection of all things. Dostoevsky's Ivan Karamazov declares, quote, it is not God whom I reject, it is creation, end quote. Nietzsche held that this rejection required the rejection, of course, of God's law. He declared, quote, the advantage of our times, nothing is true, everything is permitted, end quote. This, however, imposed a fearful burden on him. Quote, from the moment that man believes neither in God nor in immortal life, he becomes, quote, responsible for everything alive and for everything that, born of suffering, is condemned to suffer from life, end quote. It is he, and he alone, who must discover law and order. Then the time of exile begins, the endless search for justification, the aimless nostalgia, quote, the most painful, the most heartbreaking question, that of the heart which asks itself, where can I feel at home? End quote. Of the rebel, Camus observed, quote, once he had escaped from God's prison, his first care was to construct the prison of history and of reason, end quote. For Camus, quote, the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions, how to answer it, end quote. Man has a, quote, nostalgia for unity, end quote, and, quote, appetite for the absolute, end quote, quote, the mind's deepest desire, end quote, is for clarity, familiarity, and understanding, quote. Understanding the world for a man is reducing it to the human, stamping it with his seal, end quote. This is a logical conclusion for an existentialist like Camus. If the world is not God's creation, it must somehow be made man's creation. Sartre holds that man has being but no essence, no preordained pattern or meaning. Man makes his own essence and pattern and defines himself. It follows that man also wants to remake the world in his own image. Modern man feels an intense anguish as he confronts, quote, a world I never made, end quote. Man wants the pattern of his imagination to govern reality and, like God, to utter the fiat word and to see reality born at the word of his mouth. The agony of modern intellectuals is over the gap between their imagination and reality. Quote, with the exception of professional rationalists, today people despair of true knowledge. If the only significant history of human thought were to be written, it would have to be the history of its successive regrets and its impotences. Of whom, and of what indeed can I say, I know that. This heart within me I can feel and judge that it exists. There ends all I can touch. and I likewise judge that it exists. There ends all my knowledge, and the rest is construction. This very heart which is mine will forever remain undefinable to me." End quote. We live in an absurd, meaningless world. Man is surrounded by, quote, "a horde of irrationalists," end quote. This world in itself is not reasonable. That is all that can be said. But what is absurd is the confrontation of this irrational and the wild longing for clarity whose call echoes in the human heart. The absurd depends as much on man as on the world, end quote. One rational fact could save the world. It would indicate that not all is contradiction and nonsense. Quote, "The world itself, whose single meaning I do not understand, is but a vast irrational." If one could only say just once, quote, "This is clear," end quote, all would be saved, end quote. There is a conflict between man's existential quote-unquote awareness of the lack of essence, meaning, or pattern in the world, and man's urge for meaning. Quote, "I can negate everything of that part of me that lives on vague nostalgias, except this desire for unity, this longing to solve, this need for clarity and cohesion. I can refute everything in this world surrounding me that offends or enraptures me, except this chaos, this sovereign chance, and this divine equivalence which springs from anarchy. I don't know whether this world has a meaning that transcends it. But I know that I do not know that meaning, and that it is impossible for me just now to know it. What can a meaning outside my condition mean to me? I can understand only in human terms. What I touch, what resists me, that is what I understand. And these two certainties, my appetite for the absolute and for unity, and the impossibility of reducing this world to a rational and reasonable principle, I also know that I cannot reconcile them. What other truth can I admit without lying, without bringing in a hope I lack, and which means nothing within the limits of my condition?" End quote. Camus was paralyzed by his modern premises, his existentialism, aggravating his condition. As a child of Descartes, he declared, quote, "To think is first of all to create a world, or to limit one's own world, which comes to the same thing," end quote. But Camus was right. Modern philosophy cannot answer the basic question, quote, "Can we know anything?" end quote, affirmatively. Not at all surprisingly, philosophers in the modern tradition deny the historic function of philosophy. In particular, the philosophers in the logico-analytic school, Moore, Wittgenstein, and Carnap, abandon the historical functions of philosophy as of no concern to them. Some philosophers, such as Henri Bergson and Alfred North Whitehead, have still sought to understand the world in terms of some central concept. The existentialists like Heidegger and Sartre also belong to this tradition. These men attempt to find some kind of rationale for their human concerns in some aspect of man and his experience. These men do not solve the problem of epistemology, although they are aware of it. A second group is made up of pragmatists like Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. Like the first group, an intense social concern is often present. Its approach to the problem of knowledge is pragmatic. Truth is instrumental. It is what works. The third school has already been mentioned, the logico-analytic school, which is totally opposed to all that has been traditionally regarded as philosophy. The extent of this rejection is apparent in the following statements from Rudolf Carnap, born 1891, a very prominent member of this school. Quote, "Among the metaphysical doctrines that have no theoretical sense, I have also mentioned positivism, although the Vienna Circle is sometimes designated as positivistic. It is doubtful whether this designation is quite suitable for us. In any case, we do not assert the thesis that only the given is real, which is one of the principal theses of modern positivism. The name logical positivism seems more suitable, but this also can be misunderstood. At any rate, It is important to realize that our doctrine is a logical one and has nothing to do with metaphysical theses of the reality or unreality of anything whatsoever. What the character of a logical thesis is will be made clear in the following chapters. The meaning of our anti-metaphysical thesis may now be more clearly explained. This thesis asserts that metaphysical propositions, like lyrical verses, have only an expressive function, but no representational function. Metaphysical propositions are neither true nor false. Because they assert nothing, they contain neither knowledge nor error. They lie completely outside the field of knowledge, of theory, outside the discussion of truth or falsehood. But they are, like laughing, lyrics, and music, expressive. End quote. The function of propositions is to be logical in terms of the only reality man knows, his mind, and not to him beyond that. Propositions make sense only in this respect, it is held. There are no meanings beyond the words used in a proposition or beyond the people who use them. Wittgenstein's statement, quote, "The meaning is the use," end quote, summed up his position and also made evident a kinship to John Dewey. Philosophy is thus closely linked to the realities of our time. What begins as a philosopher's idea can end in marching feet and bloody conquest. At the beginning of the modern era, men held that knowledge is power, and both science and philosophy began an eager quest for power through knowledge. As men despaired of the possibility of knowledge, they turned their attention to power. Rousseau developed the concept of the general will, Hegel the idea of the state as the incarnation of soul, mind, or spirit, and men like Dewey and Wittgenstein a pragmatic concept of truth and knowledge. Quote, "The meaning is the use," end quote. By the 1960s, students were burning and destroying their universities, and their faith now was less in knowledge than in direct actions or power. George Orwell had earlier declared, quote, "If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever," end quote. The quest for knowledge had given way to the quest for power. At the same time, faith rests now not in God, in any Christian sense, nor in knowledge, as in the older humanism, but in experience, in the newer and pragmatic humanism. John Dewey in 1930 wrote that, quote, "Faith was once almost universally thought to be acceptance of a definite body of intellectual propositions, acceptance being based upon authority, preferably that of a revelation from on high. It meant adherence to a creed consisting of set articles. Such creeds are recited daily in our churches. Of late, there has developed another conception of faith. This is suggested by the words of an American thinker, quote, "Faith is tendency toward action," end quote. According to such a view, faith is the matrix of formulated creeds and the inspiration of endeavour. Change from the one conception of faith to the other is indicative of a profound alteration. Adherence to any body of doctrines and dogmas based on a scientific authority signifies distrust in the power of experience to provide in its own ongoing movement the needed principles of belief and action. Faith, in its newer sense, signifies that experience itself is the sole ultimate authority, end quote. Dewey then added that, quote, "The greatest obstacle that exists to the apprehension and actualization of the possibilities of experience is found in our economic regime," end quote. Let us examine Dewey's statement a little more closely. The older humanistic belief in the possibility of certain knowledge has given way to skepticism. The answer now is faith, but definitely not faith in the supernatural and triune God and his revealed word. Faith for Dewey means no body of intellectual proposition summed up in a creed, but faith in experience. Whereas for the Christian, faith is in God and his infallible word, for Dewey, it is in experience, which has, quote, "the sole ultimate authority," end quote. Experience is thus beyond criticism, except perhaps by experience. Quote, the possibilities of experience, end quote, can be actualized only in a new economic order, in the socialism of the great community. How do we know that this is so? We know that this is so because, by definition for Dewey, the new infallible word is experience. He prefers experience because it is a, quote, democratic and humane arrangement, end quote. Democracy promotes better human experience, and human experience promotes democracy. But how can we discriminate among experiences? The valid experience is the experience which promotes continuing growth and interaction. Growth? Towards what? Democracy, of course. Dewey has argued from a faith in democracy and experience to prove that democracy and experience are good. All his conclusions are involved in and are aspects of his presuppositions. To his partisans, it is a marvelous exercise of, quote, intelligence in the modern world, end quote. To an outsider, it is dogmatism of a humanistic faith reciting its credo and proving all things by reference to its articles of faith. Circular reasoning is in fact unavoidable. All reasoning is circular reasoning. It begins with certain premises, and those premises contain within them the totality of possibilities for that faith. The Christian reasons from God to God-given, God-created and interpreted facts, whereas the humanist reasons from man to man-made interpretations of brute factuality. All reasoning is presuppositional, and on the systematic application of humanistic premises, man can have no knowledge at all. The unbeliever gains his knowledge by borrowing Christian theistic premises while denying the God thereof. As Van Til has so well summed it up, quote, the only alternative to quote-unquote circular reasoning, as engaged in by Christians, no matter on what point they speak, is that of reasoning on the basis of isolated facts and isolated minds, with the results that there is no possibility of reasoning at all. Unless as sinners we have an absolutely inspired Bible, we have no absolute God interpreting reality for us. And unless we have an absolute God interpreting reality for us, there is no true interpretation at all. This is not to deny that there is a true interpretation up to a point by those who do not self-consciously build upon the self-conscious God of Scripture as their ultimate reference point. Non-believers often speak the truth in spite of themselves. But we are not now concerned with what men do in spite of themselves. We are concerned to indicate that the absolute distinction between true and false must be maintained when self-consciously adopted non-theistic and self-consciously adopted theistic point of view confront one another, end quote. For Dewey, all difference, contradictions and problems are resolved by his ideal society, so that conflict is replaced by community. Community is the unity of experience. For Dewey, what Descartes demonstrated in its earliest form and Kant made clear was that the idea of knowledge meant essentially experience. What Kant called the synthetic unity of apperception or self-consciousness is, quote, the highest condition of experience, and in the developed notion of self-consciousness, we find the criterion of truth. The theory of self-consciousness is method, end quote. Dewey continued, quote, but this abstract statement must be further developed. It comes to saying, on the one hand, that the criterion of the categories is possible experience, and on the other, that the criterion of possible experience is the categories and their supreme condition. This is evidently a circle, yet a circle which, Kant would say, exists in the case itself, which expresses the very nature of knowledge. It but states that in knowledge there is naught but knowledge which knows or is known, the only judge of knowledge, of experience, is experience itself. And experience is a system, a real whole made up of real parts. It as a whole is necessarily implied in every fact of experience, while it is constituted in and through these facts. In other terms, the relation of categories to experience is a relation of members of an organism to a whole. The criterion of knowledge is neither anything outside of knowledge, nor a particular conception within the sphere of knowledge, which is not subject to this system as a whole. It is just this system which is constituted, so far as its form is concerned, by the categories. End quote. If we had written this statement for Dewey, we would have been accused of caricaturing him. What Dewey said is, very simply stated, that his is indeed thinking in a circle. His is admittedly circular reasoning, but it is one, quote, which expresses the very nature of knowledge, end quote. Dewey has his own concept of infallibility, and no less than with any Christian, he begins with an act of faith. All he is saying, in effect, is that his act of faith is by definition the true one, and that of the Christian is by definition false. The Christian theist self-consciously admits that his is an act of faith, that his presupposition is the sovereign and triune God of Scripture and his infallible word. As against the unbeliever, he contends that the presuppositions of the unbeliever, if logically adhered to, make knowledge impossible, whereas the presuppositions of the Christian undergird all knowledge. The negative apologetic developed by Van Til undercuts all the claims of the unbeliever by showing him that his knowledge is gained on borrowed premises. Inconsistent Christianity, such as Arminianism, incorporates into its system a rejection of the plan or decree of God as all-inclusive and totally determinative of all reality. Man is allowed a measure of independence from God. As Van Til so plainly stated the case, thus we are back at that arch foe of Christianity, namely the idea of human ultimacy or autonomy. This idea of autonomy expresses itself in modern times by holding that in all that comes to man, he gives as well as takes. Modern philosophy has, particularly since the day of Kant, boldly asserted that only that is real for man, which he has, in part at least, constructed for himself. Nor is this modern form of manifestation of the would-be autonomous man illogical. In every non-Christian concept of reality, brute facts or chance plays a basic role. This is so because anyone who does not hold to God's counsel as being man's ultimate environment has no alternative but to assume or assert that chance is ultimate. Chance is simply the metaphysical correlative of the idea of autonomous man. The autonomous man will not allow that reality is already structural in nature by virtue of the structural activity of God's eternal plan. But if reality is non-structural in nature, then man is the one who, for the first time, and therefore in an absolutely original fashion, is supposed to bring structure into reality. But such a structure can be only, quote, for him, end quote. For, in the nature of the case, man cannot himself as a finite and therefore temporally conditioned being control the whole of reality. But all this amounts only to saying that modern philosophy is quite consistent with its own principles when it contends that in all that man knows, he gives as well as takes. It is merely the non-rational that is given to him. He himself rationalizes it for the first time, and so that which appears to him as rationally related reality is so related primarily because he himself has rationalized it. The modern form of autonomy expresses itself then both in a negative and a positive fashion. Negatively, it assumes or asserts that which is, quote, out there, end quote, that is, that which has not yet come into contact with the human mind, is wholly non-structural or non-rational in character, end quote. Although man knows little of the world, quote, out there, end quote, as a matter of faith or presupposition, the natural man assumes that it is unstructured and irrational. The positive aspect of his claim to autonomy is to declare that the world, quote, out there, end quote, is workable only if man's mind or experience gives it a pattern. Kuhn, as a scientist, uses the concept of paradigms as a constitutive of science. He admits to circular reasoning. All proof originates with the scientific presupposition or paradigm. But what is the relationship of the facts of science to the, quote, real, end quote, world? Quote, But is sensory experience fixed and neutral? Are theories simply man-made interpretations of given data? The epistemological viewpoint that has most often guided Western philosophy for 3 centuries dictates an immediate and unequivocal yes. In the absence of derived alternatives, I find it impossible to relinquish entirely that viewpoint, yet it no longer functions effectively, and the attempts to make it do so through the introduction of a neutral language of observations now seem to me hopeless. End quote. Kuhn wants a real world, such as Christians hold man has. He at once speaks of paradigms as not only, quote, constitutive of science, end quote, but also that there is, quote, a sense in which they are constitutive of nature as well, end quote. This implies that there is an ultimate degree of God in all of nature, but Kuhn will not consider this. He wants to use this possibility without admitting its reality and its logical conclusion, God and his eternal decree. He thus slips into his circular reasoning enough of God's order to keep science functioning. He admits that purpose and law in nature would cause, quote, a number of vexing problems, end quote, to quote-unquote vanish. Kuhn actually operates in terms of 2 mutually exclusive paradigms or presuppositions. First, he begins with the autonomous mind of man as the lone source of law and meaning in a meaningless world. Second, he assumes at critical points that a real world of meaningful nature, undergirded by God's law and decree, is the object of scientific inquiry rather than brute, meaningless, and utterly fortuitous factuality. Circular reasoning marks the thinking of men on all sides. The thinking of the unbeliever, however, involves a serious inconsistency. He introduces into his system ideas borrowed from Christian theism while denying its premises. On his own premises, as we shall see, he can know nothing.